Okay, thanks very much. Now I will also give my moderator's role to Bea Bermudez now, who will moderate and share the next presentation by Antonella Sorace.
Yes,
Bea,
I would like to.
are you here? Okay.
Yes, I'm here. I would like to introduce now Antonella Sorace. She is a professor of developmental linguistics at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and is a world-leading authority in the field of bilingualism across the lifespan, bringing together different methods from linguistics, experimental psychology, cognitive science, and so on. And she's also the founding director of the Research and Information Center Bilingualism Matters, which has currently 27 branches across 3 different continents. And today she will present us the talk, The Ecology of Second Language Learning and First Language Change in Bilingualism. So Antonella, thank you very much for being here. When you are ready, you can of course share your screen. You are
now.
Yes.
Are they appearing?
Yes, they are appearing.
Can
yes.
you see them? Can you hear me?
Yes, everything is working.
Good.
So when you are ready, please.
Shall I start now, or it's a bit?
I think we can start.
For the time.
We are a bit ahead, but a bit early. But I think it's.
Maybe we could wait until past, just for the people who wanted to join this talk in particular.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't want to. Hello, Antonella.
Hi.
Hello, neighbors from Edinburgh. So I'm in Glasgow at the moment.
How are you?
Weather's horrible. Fine, I'm doing well. How's Edinburgh doing?
Okay. I mean, the weather is not wonderful, but then you don't expect it to be at this time of year.
I was gonna say the same thing. The weather is nasty here. Quite a typical Scottish winter.
Yes, that's right. And yeah, we'll see what happens. We're not going anywhere.
Well, hopefully, yes. You coping with lockdown fine. How's lockdown going and all this online stuff?
Well, it's the lockdown is very difficult to understand, first of all, because all the differences, different regions, and yeah, it will be a very, very strange Christmas, but we have to live with it.
Are you hoping to go? Are you hoping to go away for Christmas at all?
No, I'm not going anywhere. I was hoping for my sons to come, but maybe one of them will manage, but the other one won't. And we just have to celebrate on Zoom. We did the same for Thanksgiving. We had a Thanksgiving celebration on Zoom, which meant we're eating turkey and looking at the screen, which was a little bit funny, but yeah.
Oh, this is the first year we're going to have online Christmas party at my department. It's going to be on Teams. Well, not big difference from Zoom, but I wonder how that's going to go. It's going to be a Christmas jumper party on. How's it going to fly?
Well, there's nothing we can do, so we just have to live through it and hope for the best. Hope for the vaccine.
Well, they started the vaccination program in Britain already.
So. Have you seen a guy called William Shakespeare? in England, the first guy to be vaccinated was called William Shakespeare.
That's telling. That's very telling.
I wonder if it means anything, that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, I don't know. Probably not much.
No, but it's a funny coincidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I thought, a couple more people just joined us. So I thought there would be people coming specifically for this talk. So let's maybe give it just a 1 minute wait. We have a very healthy hour and a half slot. So I'm sure we'll manage.
I'm sorry I couldn't join you early this morning. I'll make a point of watching Barbara's talk, at some point, but I was in a meeting. I'll do my best to join tomorrow. I set some time aside.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing you prompted me to remind everyone of is that we're recording this conference. So, and the idea is to make all these talks available to be viewed online after the conference is over. So you will be able to revisit Barbara's talk when we process the recordings and edit them and upload them. I actually don't know, maybe Mikhail know where exactly we're gonna upload them, probably our YouTube channel, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, we need to, because it's going to be a huge video, we need to cut it first into the talks, and probably we're going to upload it to our either our university's website, or maybe to our CDM Center website, Center for Cognition and Decision Making website.
But in any case, they will be made available, right?
Yeah, we'll probably have the link on the webpage of the conference, so you will be able to get the videos from there.
Okay. Great. Well, I think we could start now. So I pass it on to Bea.
Yes.
And Antonella.
Okay, shall I start? Thank you very much for the invitation to this really nice conference, and I wish we were there in person, but we can't. So however, it's nice to see people on the screen. And I'm going to talk about connections between attrition and second language learning. So connections that I'm beautifully calling the ecology, because this is an unexplored question that we are hoping to address in future research. What the balance is between changes in the first language and levels of attainment in a second language. I'm going to cross several bridges in my talk. I'm known as a bridge builder, but I think that for the kind of phenomena that I'm going to show, but also more in general, we really need to bridge gaps and cross bridges between language and other cognitive domains. So I've heard that in the end of the discussion, the previous discussion, cognitive control and effects on cognition were mentioned. I'm actually going to focus on these in the second part of my talk. So we really need to not only get out of our familiar areas of expertise. I'm a linguist, like many of us, by training, but I think interdisciplinarity really is the way forward. And interdisciplinarity also means connecting different subfields of research on language, which doesn't happen often enough, it seems to me. Again, we are specialized in particular sub areas, right? Some of us specialize in child bilingualism or adult bilingualism, on language attrition, and so on. But I really think that we should pull more threads together, or if you want a different metaphor, join more dots together. And of course, bridging gaps between research and society. I'm not going to say anything about this, but that is a very fruitful avenue as well, because not only society learns from research, but research learns from connecting to society. So we all know that what we're talking about is the fact that languages can affect each other in bilinguals. It's interesting that I come originally from the field of second language acquisition. This is what I did my original, first degree thesis about, and that's where I started. And at that point, all people talked about were the effects of the first language on the second language. So transfer from the fact that you, obviously, if you're an adult learning a second language, you already have a language, at least one, and that language exercises an influence on the second language. So people talked about transfer errors, cross-linguistic influence, and so on. More recently, as we know, we're also talking about the effects of a second language onto the first language. under the general name of attrition. We'll see later that I think the effects that we see are not just the effects of the second language grammar on the first language grammar, but more general effects of operating more than one language. In any case, the term attrition, some of you know that I'm not a great fan of the term attrition. I know that we're using it. I'm using it as everybody else. So it's used in the field, but there's no doubt that attrition has negative connotations, and one doesn't have to go very far back to see, some definitions of attrition, in the early 90s that were definitely very negative, like, the unraveling of native language abilities, the disintegration of the structure of a first language and things like that. What I'm going to suggest is actually quite different. I mean, of course, I'm not looking at the phenomena that many people looked at the beginning of the field of attrition. So people who really left their native language, their native country and their native language community for good. There were no ways of keeping in touch, and so no opportunities to keep speaking the language and so on. This is not the kind of effects that I'm looking at. I'm looking at what happens in very normal situations when people learn another language and are exposed to another language on a regular basis, but they may still, and now we have a way of keeping in touch with our native language in a variety of ways, by traveling, not right now, but, we hope again soon, by, digital resources and many other ways. So I'm going to talk about primarily about what happens in first generation people. So people who were born and raised in their native language, in their native country, and then they leave to join another country where they speak another language. So, and that I'm part of that definition. I'm a native speaker of Italian. I was born and raised in Italy, in not a completely monolingual environment. My mother was from Sardinia, but she never spoke Sardinia to me because Sardinian is not a useful language. But I heard enough of Sardinian, that she spoke with other people, other members of the family. So I have passive competence in Sardinian, but basically I grew up in a largely monolingual environment. Then I went to Scotland, where I still am, and at this point I've been here for most of my life. But what happens, when speakers leave their country and their language community, obviously they hear less input in the L1, in their native language, because they're not part of their community. So there is not only reduced exposure to input, but also reduced exposure to variation among people speaking in different ways in the original community. We know we are paying more and more attention to the role of variation. So exposure to normal, what we can call normal variation, is very important for language acquisition in any child. So if you think of a monolingual child, obviously they hear the language from many people speaking in naturally different ways. So young people, old people, men, women, children, adults, different registers, different accents, and so on. Obviously, if they are bilingual in the minority language, they may not get, that exposure to variation. Exposures to variation may actually be very crucial for maintaining the language in a situation where, such as the one that we're talking about now. So leaving your original community means not only less input, but less exposure to normal variation, which may be very crucial from the point of view of maintenance. It also means, and this is another very interesting aspect that we are going to explore, we hope, in a project if we get the money. It's the fact that attrited speakers also interact with other attrited speakers in the same community. And as we know, what happens in interactions, in this kind of interactions, is it's a lot of alignment and priming between speakers. So one relatively unexplored aspect of attrition is the synchronic transmission of changes due to attrition in interactions among attriters. So what happens, if I, for example, as an attrited speaker of Italian, interact with other Italians also in Scotland, and whether these other Italians have been, here for less time than me or more time than me, to the extent to which, they are attrited in the same way, that I'm. So what happens in spontaneous interaction? And that's a very interesting and relatively unexplored area. Obviously, then what happens, first generation speakers undergo these changes that I'm going to talk about more fully very soon. And these are the speakers who speak to the next generation, right? So intergenerational changes, due to the fact that heritage language speakers, so what now we call heritage language speakers. Again, this is a term that has gained ground in the last 5 to 10 years, because normally, we call these speakers bilingual children, bilingual speakers who are exposed to a minority language, very often spoken by speakers undergoing attrition. And this is a connection that has not really, again, being explored as much as it should. So the extent to which the input provided by attrited speakers to heritage language speakers, what the role is. What happens if children at that point, bilingual children, heritage speakers, hear enough input in the language, they tend to regularize it. I mean, children are very good at regularizing if they hear it in sufficient quantities. And the inconsistencies that they may get, the variability that I'm going to describe in a moment, if they hear it in the input in sufficient quantities, they may regularize it. And that's when the grammar actually starts changing. And many changes, diachronic changes in the grammar, at least the changes that are due to language contact, not all changes in the grammar are obviously due to this reason, but those that are due to language contact, I'm going to make the point that they don't start, the grammar doesn't start changing in first generation, but it can and does start changing in second and subsequent generations. And this is what we see in many instances of diachronic change. If children don't hear input in sufficient quantities, if they hear less and less input until below a certain threshold that is difficult to quantify, and input from fewer and fewer speakers, remember language variation, then children stop acquiring the language. Eventually, the process of intergenerational transmission stops, and that's when the language dies, and languages are dying at a greater and greater rate, as we know, because this process of intergenerational transmission stops. Now, when does the L1 start changing in first generation speakers? You've already mentioned lexical attrition that starts very early on, so I don't need to go into details, because also this is not what I'm going to focus on. We know that lexical attrition starts very, very early on, and you don't need a very high level of competence in a second language to experience, or a very long permanence in a second language environment to start experiencing attrition at the lexical level. But what about grammar? And this is where I'm going to focus on primarily the results that we got, but also trying to generalize these conclusions maybe more widely. So About grammar, we know that attrition is selective. So not all areas of grammar are affected. And I like this definition that my good friend Colin Phillips and his team actually came up with. They called complex contingencies the language phenomena that involve the integration of information across multiple levels of encoding. This is precisely what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on the selective grammatical phenomena that seem to be affected by attrition, selectively affected by attrition, because these are the phenomena that I would put at the interface between grammar and external domains. And I hope I'll make clear what I mean. So, and that's precisely the areas of grammar where we see this convergence that I mentioned in my title. So the ecology of language attrition and language learning. We see a convergence between second language learning and first language attrition, particularly for language structures that I would put at the interface between grammar and pragmatics and context or external domains. And this is the area of pronominal reference that we studied extensively. So in a language like Italian, which is, as we all know, a null subject language, what happens in the convergence is that when we study advanced second language learners of Italian, but also native speakers of Italian under attrition, we see one thing. We see that both populations overextend the scope of the overt pronoun to context in which the null pronoun would be appropriate. So we know that Italian offers a choice, an inventory of pronominal forms that includes both overt pronouns and null pronouns. What we see both in acquisition and in attrition is the extension of the overt pronoun. What do I mean? So in Italian, in let's say non-attrited Italian, monolingual Italian, although I don't like the term monolingual either, because one of the conclusions that I'm going to draw at the end of this talk is that we should really abandon the term monolingual and the monolingual comparison as a point of reference for studies on bilingualism. But we'll come back to this. In Italian, if you see a sentence like this, Paola greeted her mother when null went out, the preferred interpretation is that that null pronoun refers to the subject antecedent. We're talking about preferred interpretations here. We're talking about preferences, not strong ungrammaticality, because, you know, the other interpretation, you know, where the pronoun refers to the non-subject antecedent is also possible, but is dispreferred in this case. Whereas the same sentence with an overt pronoun, so Paola greeted her mother when she, overt, lei, went out, the preferred interpretation is that the overt pronoun refers to the non-subject antecedent, her mother in this case. Notice that this is a potentially ambiguous case where both antecedents are plausible, okay? They're plausible, both from a grammatical point of view, they're both feminine singular. From a semantic point of view, there's nothing that actually steers you in one direction rather than the other. So this is the classic case where the pronouns have a division of labor in terms of preferences, so that the null tends to refer to a subject, or if you want, the most salient antecedent. We'll come back to this. Whereas the overt pronoun tends to refer to the non-subject or to the less salient antecedent. Now, what happens in bilinguals? What happens in bilingual for overt pronouns is that the same sentence, so bilinguals, and I mean bilinguals, I mean both second language learners and first language attriters, they can accept and go for the use of the overt pronoun as referring to the non-subject, the less salient antecedent, but in addition, they increasingly accept and go for the use of the overt pronoun as referring to the most prominent antecedent, the most salient antecedent, the subject antecedent in this case. So there is increasing variability in the use of an interpretation of the overt pronoun. Interestingly, for the null pronoun, we don't see any change. So for the null pronoun, the preferred interpretation in this case remains in attrition and is acquired in acquisition, the preferred interpretation, like in monolinguals, where the null pronoun refers to the subject antecedent, the most prominent antecedent. Although, as again, we're talking about preferences, so the null subject object mapping is not completely disallowed, and depending on situations, it's not ungrammatical, but it's dispreferred. I would like to give you some more examples from a non-null subject language of these asymmetric extensions of one pronominal form of the other. The other language that we studied is German, where null subjects are not possible, but there is still a choice of pronominal forms between two overt forms. One is the personal pronoun, and the other one is a demonstrative pronoun. So that is an example, which I won't read for you. The waiter greets the cashier. Er in the top sentence, that's a personal pronoun, is apparently very nice. That tends to refer to the subject antecedent. That's the preferred interpretation of that demonstrative pronoun. Whereas the der, so the demonstrative pronoun, the preferred interpretation is the connection with the non-subject antecedent, or the less salient. So again, there is a division of labor in monolingual German that is similar, if not identical, to the division of labor between null and overt forms in a null subject language. What happens in bilingualism? Bilingual speakers of German tend to extend the scope of the demonstrative pronouns to contexts in which the pronoun, the personal pronoun, would be more appropriate. Again, what we see is that they would accept, for example, the interpretation where the demonstrative pronoun refers to the non-subject antecedent, but they also go for the interpretation where it refers to the subject antecedent. So we see increased variation in the use and interpretation of the demonstrative pronoun that we don't see in the use and interpretation of the personal pronoun. So again, we see the same kind of asymmetric extension of, if you want, the most marked form of the two available onto the less marked and most frequent form, actually. In Italian, for example, if you look at total general uses of overt versus null pronouns exceed, the production of overt pronouns by 70% versus 30%. So null pronouns are much more frequent in absolute terms compared to overt pronouns. So this is where we get into the interesting stuff. Why do we see these asymmetric effects? So the first account that we explored, and it's the most logical one, is the cross-linguistic influence that I put on the screen at the very beginning. So basically, the initial studies that we did, and many of the initial studies that were done, involve bilingual speakers where English is the other language. So bilingual speakers of Italian and English, for example. Both in acquisition and attrition. So English native speakers acquiring Italian as a native language, as a non-native language, or native speakers of Italian in a situation of attrition from English, from an English-speaking environment. So in a context like this, it makes sense to assume, at least initially, that what we see is the influence of the grammatical knowledge of one language that doesn't have a choice of overt and null subjects onto the other. So transfer effects, and that's the tack that we took at the beginning. So when English is the other language, this is the way we reasoned initially. in a way, English is the simpler language, is the language that has the least restrictive option, right? Because you don't have to bother with a choice of pronominal forms depending on whether you're referring to salient antecedents or subjects versus non-subjects and so on. I'm ignoring, and I have to make this clear, I'm ignoring the role of stress and prosodic factors in English. Stress and prosodic factors do play a role. So this is an oversimplified picture that I'm presenting. But maybe there will be questions about this. So English is the simpler language, and that is the language that affects the other, regardless of whether it's the L1 or the L2, but not vice versa. So what we see in attrition is a neutralization of an original L1 distinction towards the less restrictive L2 system. In acquisition, what we see is a neutralization of an L2 distinction towards the less restrictive L1 system. Now, an easy story to start with, definitely worth exploring. And I'm not saying, and I'm not suggesting in what comes next, that this story is completely false. It can still be an explanation, but it can't be the whole story, because there were many studies subsequently that showed an overuse of verb pronouns in second language of in bilingual speakers of two languages of the same type, with the same type of pronominal system. And so this is not an exhaustive list of overextension of verb pronouns that were found in bilinguals speaking two null subject languages, including a very recent study that we've done on Italian Sardinian bilinguals by my ex-student Michela Bonfieni. So if we see these phenomena in bilingual speakers of two null subject languages, well, the transfer explanation loses ground, right? Because, okay, we have to consider the fact that, we shouldn't oversimplify things even when we look at null subject languages of the same type, because we did a study, for example, of monolingual speakers of Spanish and monolingual speakers of Italian. Yes, two null subject languages of the same type, two identical inventories of pronominal forms. But when we look at the distribution of pronominal forms in Spanish and Italian, monolingual Spanish and monolingual Italian, if we want to simplify things this way, it's not identical. So we shouldn't oversimplify life that way. But for the time being, let's assume that there is no reason to transfer, an overt subject from another null subject language that has the same inventory of pronominal forms and a very similar distribution. Also, there are some reduced number of studies that show that the overextension of demonstratives that I mentioned for German, bilingual speakers with German, has been found in bilingual speakers of two languages that have the same inventory of demonstratives and personal pronouns. For example, Finnish-Swedish bilinguals, that study that was done quite a while ago, shows that Finnish-Swedish bilinguals use demonstratives more extensively than either Finnish monolinguals or Swedish monolinguals. A more recent study by Dutch-German bilinguals, Dutch and German again, same inventory of overt pronominal forms, similar distribution, bilingual Dutch-German tend to overgeneralize the overt subject pronoun. So, the demonstrative pronoun. We have to explore at this point a second account, and the second account is requires the interdisciplinary consideration that I mentioned at the beginning. So what if what we see is not only the result of the influence of the other language, but also a result of being bilingual? So a result of being bilingualism itself. So according to this interpretation, only processing is affected. And the processing that is affected is the processing involved in integrating grammatical and pragmatical information in real time. So to recapitulate, what we have to do when we use a pronoun or when we interpret a pronoun, we obviously have to relate the choices that our grammar makes available, right? So we have, say, a null subject grammar that makes a choice of pronominal forms available. But the actual choice of which pronominal form is appropriate depends on our ability to quickly and efficiently integrate ever-changing contextual knowledge. And those are the interface conditions that I talked about in other places in my so-called interface model of language. So these are connections between grammar and context that have to be done in real time. And they have to be done efficiently in real time. You can't just decide to do it in a particular way in the morning. You have to be able to constantly update them in real time. So point number one, the grammar itself is unaffected. This is our hypothesis at the moment. In first generation speakers, remember that we're talking about attrition in first generation speakers. The grammar itself is unaffected. You mentioned the effects of re-exposure right at the beginning, before I started talking. We have some evidence from our own studies about re-exposure, and this evidence is that the effects on pronominal reference that I mentioned before can be at least partly reversible by even a short time re-immersion in the L1 community. This is what we saw in our study on Spanish speakers in a situation of attrition in the UK, and we tested them just before they left to go back to Spain for an extended holiday, and after they came back from Spain, and they had been re-immersed in their original community. And we found that the change had been partly reversed in the direction of the control Spanish speakers in Spain that we also tested, and so compared to the attrited speakers who hadn't gone back to their original community. So the change, the reversible change, meant that these speakers who had just come back and been re-exposed were kind of in the middle between monolingual speakers in Spain and attrited speakers, Spanish speakers who hadn't gone back. So we don't have long-term data on whether the effects are completely reversible because we don't have that longer term perspective. But in the shorter run, yes, definitely we see some effects of reversibility. So what if this is a matter of cognitive control? So we know that cognitive control affects sentence processing. I'm not, obviously, this is not big news. But we also know that the effects of cognitive control tend to be more visible in processing that is more probabilistic, if you want. So involving complex contingencies, as that definition I said at the beginning, rather than in categorical syntactic processing. So the effects of cognitive control are more visible, for example, potentially in pronoun resolution as a kind of complex contingency, rather than in more, grammatical versus ungrammatical kind of syntactic processing. So what kind of aspects of cognitive control am I talking about? Well, when we use anaphoric forms, we have to be able to rapidly inhibit irrelevant pronoun antecedent mappings. So in the examples that I gave you before, clearly there was a choice of whether to attach a pronoun to one antecedent or the other. If you go for one kind of attachment, you have to exclude and inhibit the other. You have to be able to constantly update, as I said before, update your assessment of context. So you have to be able to integrate changing information from the context and from the interlocutor's knowledge state. So you have to, ask yourself, all the time, am I referring to something that is equally accessible to me and to my interlocutor or not? If so, it's appropriate to continue to drop a pronoun, for example. If not, it's not so appropriate to continue to drop a pronoun. It's more appropriate to use an overt pronoun or to repeat a full noun phrase, which is a choice that we didn't test directly. And that involves not only inhibiting, but also disengaging inhibition. And I'm coming back to this point, and updating your discourse model. So there are, some very well-known aspects of cognitive control that may be seen as being involved in using pronouns appropriately. Now, using this kind of cognitive control is resource consuming. I mean, obviously you have to employ some cognitive resources in order to do these tasks. So a very straightforward hypothesis is that cognitive resources necessary to do this mapping between pronominal forms and antecedents are not always sufficient for these tasks, because bilinguals have to employ cognitive resources to inhibit, their not wanted language, for example. We know that, in all bilinguals, all languages are simultaneously active. You have to inhibit the language or languages that you're not using. That also consumes cognitive resources. So given that there is this competition for resources, the cognitive resources necessary to do effective and precise pronominal reference mappings may not always be sufficient. Now, this goes in the direction of explaining why we see, as I said, we see a convergence between second language speakers and attrited speakers. But what I didn't say is that what we see is also a difference in the magnitude of the effect. So both populations go in the same direction. They overextend the overt pronoun. But the overextension of the overt pronoun is smaller in attrited speakers than it is in second language speakers. So if we take this tack, we can say that the reason why we see a magnitude difference is that in second language speakers, the unwanted language is still there, still dominant L1, which needs more resources to be inhibited. And that leaves fewer resources in turn to do effective, pronoun antecedent mappings. In attrited speakers, on the other hand, you can say that the unwanted languages, they're still, in some respects, less dominant L2, which needs fewer resources to be inhibited and leaves more resources to do linguistic processing. And I'm leaving aside very conveniently at this point what happens to speakers like myself, for example, who's lived in the second language country for most of my life. And so at this point, is my dominant language still Italian? I'm leaving this conveniently aside for the time being, but let's go for this kind of explanation. This is not the only hypothesis, and the one I'm going to present to you is very, very exploratory. What if what we see is not just, bilingual speakers don't always have enough resources, but also they can't always do this integration of contextual cue and updating of contextual knowledge in an optimal way. And when they don't, they use the overt pronoun as a default. So sometimes they manage to do the integration, sometimes they don't manage. When they don't manage, they stick in a pronoun as a default. Why? So they don't notice this for the time being. When the integration fails, it's not that they start using pronouns randomly, right? Which is another thing that you might expect. No, they don't use pronouns randomly. They use the overt as a default. Now, one possibility might be that what we see is a very well-known phenomena in cognitive psychology that hasn't been explored in linguistics. And this is a trade-off, a potential trade-off between ability to inhibit and ability to integrate and update. So integration of contextual information, in a sense, is the opposite, and I'm simplifying, oversimplifying things. It's the opposite of inhibition. When you inhibit, you clearly focus on what matters and one thing, one factor, and you exclude the other factors. When you integrate, you actually pull things together. You integrate, you pull things together. You connect things, so you don't only focus on one. You encourage, multiple connections. So it has been shown in cognitive psychology that these trade-offs are there in several both typical and atypical populations. So the better you are in inhibition, the less good you may be at updating and switching and integration. Or if you want, the better you are in inhibiting, the higher the cost at recovering or disengaging from inhibition, which is an important aspect of integration and updating. So if we see a trade-off, we may say that the bilingual experience, it has been shown that there may be advantages in inhibitory control, but at the same time, potential disadvantages in building central coherence. So again, the so-called bilingual advantage, we have to look at the different sides. It's not just that bilingualism gives you benefits, for good, but, there may be prices to pay. And one of the prices to pay might be, this aspect of building central coherence through integration of cues in a particular context. Integration of cues means being able to refocus attention. It doesn't mean, only to inhibit, what you don't need now, but you may need to focus on precisely the same thing that you've just inhibited in order to update your understanding of context. And that has repercussions for pronominal use. We actually studied these kind of trade-offs in a study we did a few years ago, not on, well, it was on bilingualism, but it was on negative priming. Negative priming in psychology refers precisely to this, to the slower response to paying attention to a stimulus that you've just inhibited in a previous trial. So the same stimulus that was a distractor in a previous trial becomes the focus of attention. And if you've just inhibited and you have to pay attention to the same stimulus, you're slowed down because you have to recover from inhibition. And that is known as negative priming. Just as an illustration of what negative priming means in the Stroop paradigm that we didn't employ in our study, but it's a very good illustration. The Stroop paradigm in list A is well known, right? So you have to name the color of the ink that the word is written in. So you have to say blue, but the word says red. You can't help reading that because we're all proficient readers. And so there is a clash between the name of the color that you have to name and the name, the color that the word actually says. But list B is the most interesting one from the negative priming point of view. So you have to say green, but the word says blue. But look next, you have to say blue, but the word says red. But blue is precisely the color that you've just inhibited in the previous trial. Look at the next, you have to say red, so you have to say blue, but the word says red. Okay, you have to say red now, but the word says yellow. But red is precisely the name of the color that you've just inhibited. So you are slowed down even more in list B compared to list A because of this negative priming effect. We studied negative priming in a non-linguistic task. This was a visual task in this study with bilinguals and monolinguals. And to cut a long story short, looking aside, so basically people had to pay attention to shapes, you know, so they had to pay attention, say, to O, you know, and O was presented, you know, in a frame where there was an X also, but you know, they had to inhibit the X, and they had to pay attention to O. And then, you know, in the subsequent trial, they had to pay attention to X, which was the previous destructor, but the X appears in exactly the same position as the previous stimuli. So in any case, this is, you know, testing, you know, paying attention to what you've just basically inhibited in this visual task. What we found is larger negative priming effects in bilinguals compared to monolinguals in that precise timing of presentation of the probes. And so our data definitely confirmed that bilinguals are more efficient than monolinguals at inhibiting distracting information. This study was partly replicated by Blumenfeld and Marian a few years later, where they used a combined eye tracking negative priming paradigm. And in contrast to us, they found that monolinguals were slower compared to bilinguals. So they showed more negative priming or residual inhibition than bilinguals. But the fact is that their timing of presentation of priming probes was different. So for us, it was 350 milliseconds. For them, it was 500 milliseconds. And that can really create a difference with respect to inhibitory processes. So, you know, at the point when we tested our bilinguals, they were still, you know, deeply engaged in inhibition. By the time they tested their bilinguals, bilinguals had already released their inhibitory processes. There would be more to be said about this. But what is critical is really the time course of disengagement of attention, which is also the critical focus of cognitive research on bilingualism at the moment. So the focus on post-conflict effects. And this is where individual differences may really play an important role. So at least some types of bilingual experience might actually enhance this ability to update, you know, the relevant task set in a situation of unpredictability, which is the linguistic situation that I'm interested in, you know, for the use of pronouns. So the unpredictability of a situation, some types of bilingual experience might actually give you the ability to update, you know, not only to inhibit, but also to update your assessment of the situation. And that involves disengaging attention from previously attended information and refocusing it. So if you've just, you know, been using a null pronoun and you realize that you're referring to something that is not salient anymore, you have to be able to revert, you know, the direction of inhibition that you've been applying in order to assess the situation, use the overt pronoun, that it now becomes more crucial. Bilinguals are not all the same, and this is the crucial message that I want to say. Depending on the type of experience, bilinguals may vary. They may exhibit more efficient non-linguistic inhibition linked to faster linguistic inhibition resolution, a faster return to baseline activation, so a better ability to refocus attention and disengage attention, which is crucial also for linguistic phenomena like pronominal use. But the other aspect that, you know, I want to draw your attention on is the fact that, again, I said, you know, they may not have enough resources, they may be bogged down, you know, in inhibition and not, you know, being ideally, you know, suited for disengaging inhibition. But when that happens, it's not random use of pronouns that we see, is the use of the most explicit form. So bilinguals are over explicit. They produce fewer reduced form. They generalize the most redundant form. Because let's remember that the use of an overt pronoun when you don't, it's not really needed, generally produces redundancy rather than ambiguity. So there is a sense in which bilinguals may be actually very sensitive to the avoidance of ambiguity. So they may have a higher threshold for deciding when to drop a pronoun. So this may be due because of enhanced awareness of ambiguity. If you're bilingual, you realize that, wow, I was using the wrong language, or, I wasn't clear enough. So their threshold for when to drop a pronoun becomes higher. Also, there is another aspect of cognitive research that has shown that bilinguals are better at perspective-taking abilities. So they're better at putting themselves into their interlocutor's shoes. So these two factors combined might actually mean that what bilinguals go for is communication efficiency. And this is another potential trade-off, right? So the trade-off between simplicity, so going for simpler forms that are clearly less informative, or going for more informative forms that are more complex. So this trade-off is solved by bilinguals in the direction of going for, yes, the simplest form, which is at the same time the most informative. It's the form that is the less likely to sacrifice ambiguity. It's the one that might result in redundancy, which is less damaging for comprehension compared to ambiguity. So what we see is a kind of, trend towards communication efficiency that may be due to this enhanced perspective-taking abilities. So what we see, and I would agree with Abutalebi and Green in their model, we see an adaptive cognitive control system that can be shaped in different ways by different types of bilingual experience in different kinds of contexts. And this is what we don't understand enough in our, especially when we try to bridge the gap between linguistics and cognitive psychology, but also within cognitive psychology, we need a lot more results on these individual differences. For me and for my research group, a very interesting hypothesis about these convergences between second language learners and attriters is the fact that attrition may actually be the other side of the coin of successful acquisition. So in other words, we might see, what we might see, or we might be able to see in a while after we understand these factors better than we do now, we see that at least some individuals may be able to be successful second language learners because their first language changes in particular ways. So in other words, there is a kind of cognitive reconfiguration of these speakers' cognitive space that leads to selective changes in the L1, and a potential convergence between L1 and L2 that, among other things, leads to the fact that proficient bilinguals are not like monolinguals in either language. And that's what I said at the beginning. We should really stop using the term monolinguals or using the monolingual as a point of reference because learning another language, which is becoming more and more common, or even being exposed to a bilingual and multilingual society, as recent studies by Judy Kroll and colleagues actually show, may have an effect on monolinguals, on monolingualism. And so we should really stop doing that. But what I'm suggesting is that we need a lot more studies on individual speakers. At the moment, the convergence that I was talking about between second language learning and first language attrition involve comparing two different populations, obviously, for the same language. So Italian, native Italian on one hand, second language Italian, L2 Italian on the other. But what we really need to see is what happens within the same individual speakers, and that means inevitably comparing different languages in the same individual speaker, which creates some interesting challenges. But really, the working hypothesis is that there may be individual differences in the extent to which this convergence plays a role. The convergence might actually be functional to effective, successful bilingualism in some speakers. So to recapitulate, selectivity of first language attrition, individual attrition in adult bilinguals affects only processing, not the grammar, not knowledge representations. So there is a drop in L1 input when people leave their community, an increase in the L2 input, changes in processing and access, so fewer opportunities to use the L1, fewer opportunities to do these processing adjustments in particular context to accommodate the L2, selective effects on grammatical processing. Then for the next generation, there are changes in, obviously, in the input offered to the next generation. And at that point, you see intergenerational attrition, which is of a different nature, because at that point, we can start looking at changes in grammatical representations, not just in processing, but in actual mental grammars that we don't see in first generation speakers. How am I doing for time? Should I stop now?
You can continue for
Okay, I have a few studies, just a few studies, a few slides about generational attrition, because we have, some data about that. So remember that attrited speakers provide input to heritage speakers, as we said. So heritage speakers, as we said at the beginning, may acquire either a divergence or an incomplete grammar, depending on quantity of input and type of exposure. And a divergent grammar is the outcome of children's regularization, and that's what we said at the beginning. And this is what we actually saw in some studies that we did on bilingual children. In these studies that we did with Ludovica Serratrice, we actually compared, because we were particularly interested in comparing language combinations, we compared Italian-English bilingual children and Italian-Spanish bilingual children, and we compared them with monolingual child and adult Italian and English-speaking controls, and we gave them tests of comprehension. And I'm only going to focus on subject pronouns and not on the other structures. But basically, English is obviously different from both Italian and Spanish. Italian and Spanish, as we said, are two null subject languages of the same type, and English doesn't allow you to drop a topic. In some cases, English does drop a subject in coordination, for example, but let's leave those cases aside. But the results that we found was that both younger and older, we had two age groups, Italian English and Italian Spanish bilinguals, tend to accept overt subject pronouns in null subject pronouns contexts. So these are children, right? So these are not very young children, but these are children aged 6 to 8. And so they accept, for example, overt he in that sentence as referring to Donald Duck, Paperino, which is the subject, to a significantly larger extent than monolingual controls. And interestingly, younger monolingual Italian children also tend to accept some inappropriate overt pronouns, whereas older monolingual Italian and monolingual adults don't. So what we see is that, yes, I mean, this intergenerational transmission, I mean, we didn't focus on the attrited input in this study, but I think, we should pay more attention in our studies of child bilingualism to the role of attrition in intergenerational input, because it's very, very important. So just to conclude, the broader message also for society is that languages influence each other. This is absolutely normal, predictable, and selective. Okay, so it's not a weird thing. It doesn't mean language loss. It means a normal phenomenon, and the effects are visible to different extents depending on the type of bilingual experience, the type of context, and so on. So we shouldn't expect bilinguals to behave like monolinguals of either language. And there are many, many societal implications that I don't want to mention now, but just to mention one that I gave a talk about a few days ago, you know, minority languages, transmission of minority languages. Many people still think that minority languages should be spoken like our grandparents used to speak them. Wrong. You know, minority languages that are still alive change because of language contact with the majority language, and that is absolutely normal. So speakers shouldn't be expected to speak like three generations ago. And we need bridges, as I said, in many different kinds of bridges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonella.
Thank you.
Such a great talk. It's time for questions. So
shall I stop sharing the slides?
If you want, or if you want to refer to some slide in the questions, you can remain them.
Okay. I'd stop sharing them now so that I can see people.
Sure. I remind the participants that you can ask your questions raising your hand or typing in the chat. I will check it. Yes, so we have a commentary from Felipe Kupske. I will read aloud for you if you want. So Felipe from Brazil, great talk, Professor Sorace. Thank you. You said grammar would not be affected. Of course, it really depends on how one sees representation. But I have a question that draws from phonology, so feel free not to answer. I've been investigating first-generation Brazilian migrants in London with regard to their production of Brazilian stop consonants that are quite short compared to English stops. I found that integrated immigrants produce Brazilian L1 stop consonants with immediate values between the long both for an English and the short both of Brazilian Portuguese. Would processing explain such intermediate values in the attrited speech production?
Well, thank you for the question, which is very interesting, but I'm not an expert in phonology, and that has to be clear. I can ask my husband, you know, if you want, who is an expert in phonology. I don't know, I mean, intermediate values. Well, I think that what I said and what other people said about effects of re-exposure is very instructive. I mean, certainly very instructive from a grammatical point of view. Whether it's very instructive also from a phonetic and phonological point of view, that remains to be seen. But clearly, if an effect of attrition can be reversed, I think it's difficult to talk about changes in the grammar. I think, you know, it's more appropriate to talk about changes in the way grammar is accessed and processed. So access to grammatical knowledge and processing of grammatical knowledge rather than changes of grammatical knowledge itself. Yes, of course, you know, this assumes the existence of grammatical representations, right, and processing. And I know that not everybody would agree with that starting assumption that you can actually isolate grammatical representations from processing. So if you start from a different set of assumptions, you may actually want to reject that, you know, this particular explanation. But it seems to me that, you know, studying effects of re-exposure would be more extensively would be a good way of addressing this question.
We have also another question from Hamutal Kreiner. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. Can you elaborate on the prosodic influences related to language transfer effects you mentioned very briefly?
Can I elaborate on what? Sorry.
Can you elaborate on the prosodic influences related to language transfer effects that you mentioned very briefly?
Oh, well, yes, I wish it's something that I've conveniently excluded, because I'm not into phonetics and phonology, but I think that for the sake of having a complete picture, and again, building bridges even within the study of language and studying different aspects of languages, we should actually build that bridge. Because it's true that, English doesn't have a choice of overt and null pronouns, but it can mark topicality, with stress, for example. So with prosodic means, and if we go along that route, then the question is, is the prosodic way of marking topicality and so on open to attrition and in the same direction or with similar effects? The answer is I don't know. Maybe some people have looked at this.
Thank you for the answer. We have some more from the chat. I will read. Let me 1 second. We have another one. I have a similar question to Felipe regarding whether representations cannot be affected. In my study, I look at native German speakers living in the Netherlands. I found that the speakers oftentimes use new constructions, for example, verb-noun combinations that are unconventional in German, accept them in grammaticality judgments task, and even reject the old conventional combinations. Do you think that this will be an indication that the grammatical representation has changed?
It's difficult to tell. I mean, obviously, what I presented is a hypothesis that can guide, and can be contradicted, if we find convincing data, that, for example, a study like this might actually contradict, this original hypothesis. It really, I think we also need to use different kinds of methods to address this question, right? Because, the kind of, and I'm as guilty as anybody else, the kind of methods that we used in much of the original research where, grammaticality judgments, also, a little bit more lively than simply saying, is this sentence correct or not? But still, grammaticality judgments, even in children. What we need is a lot more a stronger connection, not only with online data, but also with brain data. And I don't think we have enough of those connections, to make sense of what is really happening. I mentioned the study, for example, on the effects of being in a multilingual community, the recent study by Judy Kroll and her team on people who were passively exposed to multilingual communities in the United States compared to people monolinguals, right? I mean, everybody defined themselves as monolinguals, but some people were in California where, people are obviously exposed to many more languages than in central Pennsylvania, where there is a lot less exposure to multilingual communities. And then everybody had to learn a new language, and the new language was Finnish, which is a very complex language, as we know. And bilinguals, there were also bilingual controls and so on. And both behavioral and non-behavioral data were collected. So non-behavioral, brain reactions two particular Finnish structures. And the main differences we're seeing in the non-behavioral data, so in the brain reactions, of the effects of passive exposure to multilingual societies. Now, no difference was seen at the behavioral level. So in the behavioral tasks, there was no difference between Californians and Pennsylvanians. But in the brain data from the Californians was really more similar to the brain data from the bilinguals. So again, you know, we really need not only more data in general, but more data of different types.
Thank you very much. I will go to two more questions in the chat and one raised hand. We have a question from Angelica. Thank you for this really interesting talk. I would like to know if you also check for the parental input that the children receive with respect to pronoun resolution. For example, if in the last studies you presented on Italian, Spanish, English heritage.
As I said, no, we didn't pay attention on parental input in those studies, and we should have done. With hindsight, you know, I would say yes. I mean, we clearly, and this, I think it's interesting, because why should we pay more attention to the relationship between parental attrition, especially in first generation, but also in subsequent generations, and intergenerational transmission, because that is, I think, you know, the default case. All the studies, you know, if not all, the vast majority of studies that have been done on bilingual language acquisition involve at least one attrited parent, if not both attrited parents. Not only that, I mean, if you want to go beyond that, they also involve a native speaker, maybe of the majority language, who's also regularly exposed to the minority language. So again, on the assumption that, you know, even exposure can have some effects, or it might actually predispose the brain to some effect, some changes, then I think, you know, parental input is really, really important, not just from the point of view of quantity of input, but also from the point of view of, you know, whether the parental input is attrited or exposed to another language in any case. So we didn't pay attention to that. We should have, and I hope that, you know, we will in our future studies.
Thank you. I will let Valeria Turina to ask the questions. She's for a long time waiting. So Valeria, you can turn off your microphone. Turn on, sorry. Yes.
So thank you for the talk. And I just noticed some grammatical feature among my friends, and this is not a study, just my subjective observation. So my friends who speak only Russian, they're more likely to use the imperative verbs in requests, for example, but those who also speak English tend to use indirect forms more often for requests. And so in your opinion, this could be the result of this interferences, yes? Or so the second language influenced the first language, or it is just a cultural feature of specific people, because this is a very big change in the in structure of sentence, and I'm not sure that second language can make that much difference.
I don't know enough about Russia, you know, to be a Russian to be able to assess, you know, the significance of those structures, and whether, you know, what I want to make clear is that and again, you know, it's a hypothesis that can be contradicted by future research, and, you know, in a way, we all hope that, you know, there will be more research that partly at least contradicts, you know, what we're thinking, because that's the way research goes. But I've been focusing on the syntax pragmatics interface, right? So I don't know whether the structures that, you know, you mentioned, you know, have to do with that kind of interface, or in any case, interfaces that require, you know, this rapid adjustment to changing contextual features in context, right? If they do, then I want to make clear that the two hypotheses that I presented, the two possible explanations, are not mutually exclusive. So on the one hand, you know, you can have the effects of a language that obviously doesn't have the choice, for example, or, you know, so the effects of overgeneralizing the structure that is shared, you know, by the two languages, if you want, at least superficially shared, and leads to the overextension of that structure in common. The other explanation that relies on the fact of being bilingual, regardless of the languages that you speak, is not mutually exclusive, but it could be additional. So we might think that, you know, depending on language combinations, you might actually have the two factors joined together, which make the phenomenon stronger, you know, at the level of magnitude. Okay, it might be the same phenomenon, but, you know, at the level of magnitude, if there are two possible causes, it would be stronger than when there is only one. So the fact of being bilingual, but in two languages that are, in most respects at least, very similar. So so it's not an either or. And I would like to know more about the structures that you mentioned, you know, and understand, you know, the kind of phenomena, whether, you know, it sounds very interesting. Thank you.
We have one more question in the chat I would read from Marie Vestergaard. Would you agree that we might need to make a distinction between saying that representations are affected and changed? Lack of activation of the L1 over extended periods of time could make the representations weaker and thus more susceptible of cognitive linguistic impairment, but not necessarily completely changed. What do you think about this point?
It's an interesting point, Marit.
Marit, you can also turn on your mic if you would like to discuss more interaction.
It's a very interesting question. That yeah, what does it mean exactly to say that the mental representations become weaker? That's what we need to understand better, it seems to me, right? Do they become weaker, and therefore, I mean, my hypothesis, again, you know, it's a hypothesis open to disconfirmation, is that in first generation speakers who were born and raised with a particular language, the knowledge representations are not open to change. Now, can that be at least partly invalidated by really looking at, for example, length of residence, you know, away from the original community as one of the factors, or interactions, size of the migrant community in the L2 environment. So, you know, if you regularly interact with other attracted speakers, you know, so would that have an effect both on your original language representations, but also have an effect on the changing, you know, aspects of grammar from the point of view of access? So the thing is, we don't know, but I think we would need to define more precisely what we mean by weakened language representations, in what sense and by what?
Sure, I agree with you, but I think it's an interesting way of explaining why you see these effects in processing, because processing and the representations must hang together, right? And if the representations are weaker, then that could explain why you see these effects in processing.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
what I said was that when the representations are weaker, they are more, the grammar is more susceptible to cross-linguistic influence from the other language.
Again, you know, that depends on the, you know, level of use, right? So people who really stop using their language for some reason, right? They don't interact, you know, with other speakers. They don't have you know, so that kind of weakness, right? As opposed to, well, we need more points of comparison. I mean, clearly, you know, if there is less use of the language, there's also, you know, less opportunities to engage the processing abilities, right? So, I mean, you know, so yeah, weakened representations and weakened processing, if there is really much reduced use, you know, both of them are potentially, you know, weaker. The question is, if you, okay, if let's say we do an experiment on people, the kind of experiment that we couldn't have done a century ago on those communities that left, you know, their native country for good, and they didn't go back, and so on. And so, you know, language loss, that was the original definition. But suppose that you have access to those speakers, and then you re-immerse them suddenly in their original community. So would you predict that, you know, the representations are reactivated or not? Or would you predict that they are reactivated to a lesser extent than the representations of people who have been using their native language more often? That's a question, right?
That's a question, yes.
It is a question. We have to address it.
Any more questions, please? We have 5 minutes, more or less, until the next guest. Something in the chat, maybe? No?
And I think, you know, one of the aspects that, again, we need a lot more data on is individual differences, as I said. And I, like anybody else, you know, coming from the same background, we tend to, for a long time, we tended to underestimate, you know, individual differences, because we're more interested in universals and what everybody has in common. But it seems to me that individual differences at the level of experience and individual differences at the level of individual cognitive background, by which I don't mean intelligence, of course, you know, but I mean, you know, these changes, you know, for example, in aspects of cognitive control. Well, you know, those are definitely worth looking at in more detail.
We have one more question from Martina Penkia. You can, Martina, switch on and ask.
Already switched on. Thanks for a wonderful talk. Very inspiring. I was wondering if it would also matter whether, as an attrited speaker, you speak to a so-called monolingual speaker of Italian in pronoun use, or whether you speak to another L1 attrited speaker of Italian. So would you also take the hearer's perspective and the hearer's knowledge of the language into account, and would it differ in pronoun use?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for allowing me to go back to something that I mentioned, you know, very, very briefly. The fact that, as I said, I hope we will get a grant, you know, to work on this. The transmission of the potential transmission of these effects in interactions, you know, within the same attrited community. So yeah, I would say that, you know, real monolinguals are not there, you know, but there are people with different levels of attrition, right? So people, you know, with different lengths of residence, different access to variation, different all kinds of things. People married, you know, to other speakers of the same language as opposed to another language, all kinds of differences. So what happens when people interact with one another? We know from plenty of research in psycholinguistics that, you know, there is a tendency to prime each other. Right? Now, the effects, whether that priming, you know, has more long-term effects than so you get priming, and you can see the effects of this priming in what immediately follows, for example, and there are plenty of experiments on this. Whether that also leads to reinforcing certain kinds of changes, okay, in one direction or the other, that is the question that I think has to do with what you were talking about, and that we need to investigate more fully. And that, in turn is related to the size of a community, right? And how many speakers are around there, and so how many opportunities of synchronic interaction there are. But the question is, does the interaction, say, for a more attrited speaker to a less attrited speaker, does the interaction lead to a happy medium, or does that lead to the less attrited speaker to go in the direction of the more attrited speaker, or the other way around? And so, these are all very interesting questions that we need to address in experimental research.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Any more questions? Some brief question?
Please send some questions by email, or I think we have a global discussion tomorrow, right?
No, tomorrow is just 3 talks, 3 keynote speakers in the morning, and then we have a closed discussion.
A closed discussion, that's what I meant, yeah.
Yes, yes.
I'll be there at that discussion for sure.
We will send a reminder just in case.
Okay. But please,
so if no more questions, thanks very much again, Antonella, for such a great talk.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much.
Let's switch to our next speaker, or last keynote speaker for today. Let me introduce you Arturo Hernandez. Arturo is a professor of psychology at the University of Houston. His major research interest is in the neural underpinnings of bilingual language processing and second language acquisition in children and in adults. And recently, his work has led to a new theoretical framework, so-called neurocomputational emergentism, that he will present us in his talk today: sensory-motor plasticity and cognitive flexibility, a neuro-emergentist approach. So Arturo, please, when you are ready, you can share your screen with us, with your presentation. You have the rights of